I was leaving work on a normal Tuesday evening. It had been a long day at the office, and I was looking forward to getting home, eating a good dinner, and maybe watching a movie. As I walked out of the building, I heard my phone buzz in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw an emergency alert. The message was short and plain. Emergency alert. Unidentified object in the sky over Northvale. Stay indoors and await further instructions. At first, I thought it might be a mistake or just another news message. But as I looked around, I saw my friend Ryan standing near his car, his eyes wide and his face full of worry. "Ryan, did you just get that alert?" I asked in a shaky voice. He nodded slowly and said,
"Yeah, I got it. But I don't understand. It says we should stay inside."
I stood there, confused and a bit scared. I looked up at the sky. Normally, I would see the usual colors of dusk, but tonight, something was very different. There, far above the town of North Vale, was a huge, dark shape. It looked like a person, but not like any person I had ever seen. It was enormous, and its head was filled with many small, blinking eyes. Its mouth was open in a strange, wide grin, full of uneven, sharp teeth that made me shiver. "Ryan, look up there," I shouted, pointing to the sky. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The sight was so strange and frightening that I could hardly believe my eyes. The emergency alert on my phone and the sight of that huge, twisted figure high in the sky made everything feel too real. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat on my skin. I fumbled with my phone, trying to call 911, but my hands were shaking so much that I could barely hold it steady. "Hello?" I managed to say. "There is something huge in the sky. It looks like a giant figure with many eyes and a big, scary mouth. I saw it. I saw it swallow a plane." I don't remember much after that. The call ended quickly, and I was left with only my racing thoughts and the cold reality of that night. Soon, 2 black SUVs pulled up next to me and Ryan. 2 men in dark suits stepped out of one of the vehicles. One of them, tall and with a serious look, said, "For your safety, please come with us now." His voice was calm but firm, and I could tell he was not joking. Ryan and I exchanged a quick look, and without a word, we both got into the SUV. As we drove away, I kept glancing at the sky. That horrible figure still hung there, as if it was watching us. The car's radio played a quiet but repeating version of the emergency alert. "Emergency alert. Unidentified object over North Vale. Stay indoors." We drove through streets that suddenly looked empty and strange. The usual buzz of evening traffic was missing, and every light and shadow seemed to add to the eerie feeling of the night. After a few minutes, the SUV pulled up in front of a small, plain building on the edge of town. A sign on the door read, "North Vale Safe House." The agent told us, "This is a safe place. We have set it up for emergencies like this." Inside the safe house, the lights were harsh and the room smelled of disinfectant and old paper. We were led down a narrow hallway to a quiet room where a man waited for us.
"I'm Mr. Daniels,"
he said as he shook my hand.
"I know this is hard to believe, but what you saw in the sky is real."
His tone was gentle and clear. Mr. Daniels explained in simple words.
"There have been small reports like this for years, but nothing like tonight. The object in the sky is not from our world. We believe it is a creature or a thing from another place, a place we do not understand."
He paused and looked at Ryan and me with serious eyes.
"It may sound like a dream, but it is real, and you both can see it clearly. People like you, we call them seers, have a special ability to see what others do not."
I listened carefully, my mind still trying to catch up. I thought back to some strange moments in my life, times when I saw odd lights or heard strange sounds, but I had always brushed them off as tricks of the mind or the result of being tired. Now, It all made sense in a terrifying way. Mr. Daniels continued.
Tonight, we lost a plane. Reports say that the creature in the sky moved close to the plane and caused it to vanish in a flash of fire and smoke. We do not know how many people were on that plane, but we are very sorry for their loss.
My stomach churned at the thought. I remembered the brief flash of light I had seen earlier when the creature had seemed to move, and it made my heart feel heavy with fear. The safe house room was quiet, except for the sound of Mr. Daniels' calm voice and the occasional beep of the radio. I sat down on a worn-out chair next to Ryan, who was still staring at the small window, as if he hoped the sky would change its horrible shape. The room felt like a fragile island of normality in a sea of chaos. Outside, I could still see the dark figure against the night sky, its many eyes shining faintly like distant stars in a nightmare. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. I just don't understand how this is happening, I said softly. Ryan didn't reply at first. He just stared ahead, lost in his own thoughts. Mr. Daniels spoke again, his voice steady.
We are working hard to understand these events and to protect everyone. You and a few others who can see these things clearly are very important to us. Your eyes are not playing tricks on you.
I nodded, even though I wasn't sure what to say. Everything felt so sudden and overwhelming. I thought about my regular life, going to work, meeting friends, watching TV, and now all that seemed far away. The world had changed in one single night, and there was nothing normal about it anymore. Mr. Daniels then handed us a folder with some papers inside.
These documents contain reports and records of past events similar to tonight, though nothing has ever been as big as this. Read them if you can, but please be careful. This is not just a warning. It is a call to pay attention to what is happening around us.
I took the folder and flipped through the pages, my hands still trembling. The words were plain and simple, but the stories they told were full of fear and loss. As the evening wore on, the safe house filled with a mix of quiet conversations and anxious silence. Every now and then, we would hear a faint sound from outside, a rumble in the distance or a soft thud against the building that made our hearts skip a beat. I sat near the window and looked out, trying to understand how something so terrible could be happening in our town. Ryan finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper.
Do you think this will ever go away?
He asked, his eyes searching mine for an answer. I wished I could say something reassuring, but all I felt was fear. I don't know, I replied honestly, but right now, it feels like nothing will be the same again. In that moment, I realized that life had taken a sharp turn. I was no longer just a regular person living an ordinary life. I was part of something much bigger and much scarier. The emergency alert, the dark figure in the sky, and the serious faces around me all told a story of a world that had been opened up to a terrible, unknown danger. I sat back in my chair and tried to let Mr. Daniels' words sink in. The safe house was a small, temporary shelter, but it was the only place that made me feel a little safe in that frightening night. As I listened to the soft hum of the radio and watched the dark sky through the window, I knew that I had to keep my mind clear and my eyes open. I had to remember everything because what we were going through was real, and it was only the beginning. Later that night, the safe house became even quieter and more tense. I sat on a hard metal chair in a small room with a few other people who had gathered here. The air felt cold and heavy. I could hear the soft sound of the emergency radio in the background, its message repeating over and over. The message said, "Emergency alert. Unidentified object in the sky over North Vale. Remain indoors." Even though we had all heard it before, the message did not bring any comfort. It only made us feel more afraid. I looked around at the faces in the room. Ryan sat near the window, his eyes fixed on the dark sky. A few others whispered quietly or stared at their phones, trying to read any news updates. I could see worry on everyone's face. In the corner, an older lady hugged her arms and trembled. I wished I could say something to calm her down, but I did not know what to say. Mr. Daniels, the man who had met us earlier, came back into the room. He carried a few papers in his hand and walked slowly. His face was serious.
I have some new information,
He said in a soft voice.
We have just received another report from the radio. They say that there are more sightings of this strange object in other parts of North Vale. People are seeing small shapes, almost like tiny copies of the big one. Some even say they heard strange sounds coming from the sky.
His words made my stomach twist. I looked at Ryan and saw that he too was feeling the heavy weight of these words. Small shapes? I asked quietly. Like little versions of that giant figure? Mr. Daniels nodded.
Yes, exactly. It seems that the big thing in the sky might be sending out smaller parts of itself. We do not know why, but it is very dangerous. The emergency services have been stretched thin because of this, and the news says that more people are now reporting odd happenings.
At that moment, one of the other agents came into our room, looking very tired and with a bruise on his cheek. "I'm Officer Miller," he said, his voice shaking a little. "We just got a call from someone near the old mill on the edge of town. They saw a small dark figure run across the field and vanish quickly. It was as if it melted into the night." Everyone listened carefully. The room felt so still that even a small sound seemed loud. I sat back and thought about what was happening. It was hard to believe that this was real. Just hours ago, I was on my way home from work, expecting a normal evening. Now I was hiding in a safe house, listening to reports of strange shapes and odd sounds in the dark sky. As the night wore on, the radio kept sending out more updates. The voice on the radio was calm, but it did not sound hopeful. "All residents of North Vale are urged to remain inside. Do not leave your homes or go near open areas. Follow instructions from local authorities." I felt a chill run down my spine with each repetition. I tried to write down what I was hearing on a notepad. I scribbled simple notes like small shapes, old mill, and strange sounds. I wanted to remember every detail, hoping that later I could make sense of all these pieces. My hand shook as I wrote, and I had to pause to steady it. It felt as though the simple act of writing was my only way to feel in control. I looked at Ryan again. He leaned close and whispered,
I keep thinking about that big figure from earlier. I can't get it out of my head. It is like it is watching me, even now.
His eyes were wide, and I could see the fear in them. I wished I could reassure him, but I felt as scared as he did. A loud bang suddenly echoed through the safe house. Everyone jumped. The door to the room rattled, and the lights flickered for a moment. Mr. Daniels stood up quickly and said,
Stay calm. That sound might be from outside, or it might be just the building settling. I will check it out.
He stepped out into the hallway, and for a few long minutes, we waited in silence. After what felt like an eternity, Mr. Daniels came back. His face was calm, but I could see the worry in his eyes.
It appears to be nothing major, just some debris falling from the building above. We must be on edge because of everything that is happening.
His words did little to ease our fear, but we tried to nod along. I sat near the window again and looked out at the dark street. Outside, the night was full of shadows and uncertainty. I could not see much detail, but I knew that the big, scary shape was still somewhere in the sky, like a dark promise of more terror to come. Around midnight, another update came in over the radio. "Emergency alert. Reports of smaller moving shapes continue to come in. Stay indoors and avoid any direct contact. Local authorities are responding." The message repeated itself, and this time there was a slight static in the background. I listened carefully, trying to catch every word. I turned to Ryan and said, "Do you think they are coming closer? Maybe they are trying to break through or something?" He hesitated for a moment before replying,
I don't know, but I keep thinking that we are not safe anywhere right now. What if they start coming into our homes? I can't imagine what that would be like.
His words made me feel even more nervous. I remembered the image of that huge figure with many eyes, and I thought about how I felt trapped in a nightmare that I could not wake up from. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to breathe slowly and steady myself, but the sound of the radio and the occasional creak of the safe house made it hard to relax. A while later, a young man named Chris, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, spoke up. "I heard something on my phone earlier. My neighbor said that near the park, someone saw a little figure run quickly across the lawn and then disappear behind a tree. It looked almost like it was moving in a hurry, as if it had a purpose." Chris's words sparked a quiet conversation among us. We began to wonder if these small shapes were trying to tell us something. Were they parts of the bigger creature? Were they a sign that the danger was growing? I did not have any answers, only more questions that made my head spin. In the midst of all this, Mr. Daniels came back into the room and said,
I need everyone to stay together and to write down everything you see or hear. Every detail might help us later. We are collecting all these reports so that we can understand what is happening. Even the smallest detail is important.
His calm but firm tone made it clear that we were now part of a bigger effort to fight this unknown threat. I looked around the room again. The safe house was filled with people of all ages, a few older folks, some teenagers, and even a couple of small children with their parents. Everyone's eyes were fixed on their phones or the window, as if waiting for something to happen. The sense of togetherness was comforting in a small way, even though the fear was almost too heavy to bear. I tried to listen carefully to the radio and also to the quiet murmurs of the people around me. It was a long, dark night, and each moment felt slow and filled with worry. I kept writing in my notepad, trying to capture every word, every sound, every small detail. I knew that later, these notes might help us understand what was really going on. As the hours passed, the feeling of uncertainty deepened. The building creaked, and sometimes there was a sound that might have been someone crying softly in the hallway. I could not tell if it was fear or sadness, but it added to the heavy mood in the safe house. I looked at Ryan, who seemed lost in thought.
I just want things to go back to normal,
He said quietly.
I miss my quiet home, my regular life.
I did not have a real answer for him. I simply held his gaze and nodded, feeling the same longing for normalcy, even though I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Before long, the radio fell silent for a few minutes. In that silence, the safe house felt like it was holding its breath. Then, the emergency voice returned, even more urgent this time. "Emergency alert. Unidentified objects continue to appear. All residents must remain indoors. Do not leave until further notice." We all listened, and the words seemed to echo in the small room. I could feel the fear growing inside me, and I could see that everyone else was feeling it too. The night had become a long wait, filled with uncertainty and hope that somehow things would get better. I sat there with my notepad, trying to piece together the events of the night. I did not know how long we would be stuck in this safe house, or what would happen when we finally stepped outside again. All I could do was write, listen, and wait in this dark, uncertain night. After those long, restless hours in the safe house, things began to change. I sat at a small wooden table in a quiet corner while others whispered softly or stared out of the window. The radio continued to repeat its alert, and every so often, I scribbled down notes in my worn notepad. I still couldn't believe how much my life had turned upside down in just one night. Mr. Daniels came back into our room with a stack of papers and a tired look on his face.
I have more details now.
He said, his voice gentle but heavy. He explained that similar incidents had happened in other nearby towns over the past few weeks, though they were not as dramatic as what we had seen tonight.
These events have been building up slowly. There are clues in old records and reports from people like you and me who have seen things.
His eyes swept the room, and I could see that everyone was listening carefully. He handed a few of us copies of a printed report. I unfolded mine slowly. It was filled with dates, names, and short statements from people who had seen strange lights, odd shapes, or felt a cold presence. One report, written by a man named Ben Carter, mentioned that he saw a dark figure at the edge of his farm long ago. The words were written in plain language, much like my own notes, and they made me wonder if I had experienced something similar as a child. Mr. Daniels went on to say,
Some of you, especially those called seers, have a unique sensitivity to these events. This means that you might have been noticing small things for a long time, even before tonight. These details may seem unimportant now, but they could help us understand why this is happening.
I felt a mix of fear and a strange comfort, knowing that I wasn't the only one who had ever seen odd things. Ryan nodded slowly, his eyes distant as he remembered something from his past. The room grew quiet as Mr. Daniels took a deep breath.
We believe that these strange events are connected to a tear in our sky, a kind of break between our world and another. That tear has allowed these dark, unexplainable figures to appear. Until now, they were small and fleeting. But tonight, something changed, and the main event was seen by everyone.
His words were simple, yet they carried the weight of many lives and lost moments. I looked around at the faces in the room. Some were scared, others thoughtful, and a few tried to hide their worry behind forced smiles. I remembered my own racing heart when I first saw that massive figure, and I wondered what it would mean if more of these events happened. So, you're saying that all these small signs from the past, they were warnings? I asked quietly. Mr. Daniels nodded.
Yes. For many years, people have reported strange things, but most dismiss them as tricks of the mind or old superstitions. Now we know there is a truth behind them, and you, as seers, are very important. Your memories, your notes, and your observations can help us piece together a plan to stop this from getting worse.
At that moment, a young man named Chris, who had been sitting near the back, spoke up in a soft voice. I remember when I was little, I used to see strange lights in the fields. I thought they were just fireflies or something, but now I wonder if they were something more. His words were honest and raw, and they made the rest of us realize that our past experiences were connected in ways we had never thought about. The conversation continued for a long time. People shared small stories. One woman talked about hearing soft whispers when she was alone at night, and another man recalled a moment when he felt a cold hand brush against his arm in the dark. All these little memories added up, painting a picture of a world where these strange events had been happening quietly for years. As we talked, the safe house itself seemed to sigh with the weight of our words. Every so often, the old building creaked, as if it too was affected by the strange forces outside. The emergency radio still repeated its message, and the silence between announcements was filled with our quiet voices and the scratching of pens on paper. I found myself thinking about my own life. I had always considered myself an ordinary person. I worked, I spent time with friends, and I never thought much about the odd things that happened in the background of my life. But now I realized that I had been noticing details. A flicker of light on the edge of my vision, a sudden chill on a warm evening. Maybe those moments were my own warnings, hints that something was not right. Ryan, sitting beside me, looked up from his notepad.
I never told anyone before,
He said.
but sometimes at night I'd feel like I was being watched. I'd hear soft sounds outside my window, and I would wake up with a feeling of dread.
His voice was low and full of a kind of sorrow.
I thought it was just my imagination, but Maybe it was something real all along.
His confession made me wonder about all the times I had brushed off similar feelings. In that moment, I felt a mix of fear and a strange connection to the past, like our lives were all part of one long, quiet warning that we had only now begun to understand. Mr. Daniels then mentioned something else.
We have been working on a way to monitor the tear in the sky. A small team is out there using cameras and sensors to track the movements of these figures. Our hope is that by understanding their behavior, we can predict when and where they might appear next. It is a slow process, but every detail helps.
His calm manner was reassuring, even though the situation was anything but calm. The idea of watching the sky and trying to predict these events made me feel both scared and oddly determined. I started to think that maybe our role as seers was not just to record the horror, but to help prevent it from getting worse. I looked down at my notepad and thought about all the little details I had written down since the emergency alert first came. Every observation, no matter how small, might be a clue. The night grew deeper, and the chatter in the safe house slowly faded into a quiet murmur as people tried to rest. I sat by the window, still scribbling in my notepad, and watched the dark sky. The wind was gentle, and for a brief moment, the normal sounds of the night returned. But even then, I knew that the peace was only temporary. In the soft glow of a flickering lamp, I read through some of the old reports Mr. Daniels had given us. The words were simple, written by people who had lived through moments of quiet terror. I could almost feel the fear in their words, and I knew that I too was now part of that long chain of people who had seen things that defied explanation. Every so often, I would glance at Ryan. He was lost in his own thoughts, writing something down carefully. I wondered what memories he was recording, memories of a time before tonight when everything was normal, or memories of strange moments that he had never understood until now. The safe house became a small world of its own that night. We were all there together, bound by the shared experience of fear and uncertainty. And as the hours slowly passed, I felt a quiet resolve growing inside me. I knew that I had to remember everything, not just for myself, but for all of us. Our stories, our memories, and our notes might one day help us understand why these strange events were happening and what we could do to stop them. I closed my notepad and took a deep breath. Outside, the radio continued its endless loop of alerts, and the dark sky held secrets that we could barely imagine. Yet, in that quiet, safe house, among people who had all been touched by fear and the unknown, I felt that together we might just have a chance to find answers. For now, all we could do was wait and listen, record and remember. Around midnight, as we continued to sit in that safe house listening to the radio, a deep rumble suddenly shook the building. At first, it was just a low vibration that you might think came from a passing truck, but then the shaking grew stronger. I looked up from my notepad and saw the walls tremble. Ryan gripped my arm tightly, and I could see fear in everyone's eyes.
Did you feel that?
Whispered Ryan. I nodded, my heart pounding even faster. Mr. Daniels stood up immediately and said,
Everyone, stay calm and follow me.
His voice was steady, but I could tell he was worried too. We all hurried down a narrow corridor. The floor creaked beneath our feet, and each step made the shaking worse. I kept thinking about that terrible figure in the sky and wondered if it had something to do with what was happening inside the building. Outside the door, I could faintly hear the sound of falling debris and distant sirens that mixed with the low rumble of the safe house. When we reached a heavy service door at the end of the corridor, Mr. Daniels paused and looked at us.
This door leads to an underground passage. It's our best chance to get out of here safely.
His words were simple, but they filled us with a mix of hope and dread. We knew that leaving meant stepping into the unknown, but staying here was no longer an option. One by one, we stepped through the door. The underground passage was dark and narrow, lit only by a few weak emergency lights mounted on the wall. I could hear my footsteps echoing in the tight space, and the air was cool and musty. I clutched my notepad as if it were a lifeline, trying to remember every detail of the night. I knew that if I forgot even a small thing, it might be lost forever. As we moved slowly down the passage, I could feel the building above us groaning and creaking. At times, the shaking would stop for a few seconds, and in those moments, I could hear muffled voices and even the soft crying of someone somewhere in the dark. It made the silence even heavier. After what felt like a long, endless walk, the passage opened into a larger space, a sort of underground hall that served as an emergency exit point. There were several others there, huddled together, looking tired and scared. The air was filled with a mixture of dust and the faint smell of smoke from the damage above. I saw a few people trying to comfort each other, while others simply stared blankly, lost in thought. Mr. Daniels gathered us all and said,
We must move quickly. The structure above is becoming unsafe. We need to get to the community center outside, where our evacuation team is waiting.
His voice was clear and calm, and for a moment, it made us all believe that maybe we could get through this. We were led through another set of narrow corridors until we finally reached a heavy metal door that opened onto a stairwell. The stairs led downward, and the sound of our hurried footsteps mingled with the distant crashing of debris. Every step we took felt like a race against time. I could feel the cold, hard steps under my feet and the pressure of the darkness pressing in from all sides. As we emerged from the stairwell into the chilly night air, I looked up. The sky above North Vale was filled with dark clouds, and the moon's light struggled to break through. In the distance, I could still see a faint outline of that terrible figure, a giant twisted shape with many eyes. It looked even more haunting from here, high in the sky, as if it were watching over the ruined town. Outside, the streets were a mess. Cars were overturned, and broken glass crunched underfoot as people hurried along. Some faces were marked with relief at having escaped the collapsing building, while others showed the deep worry of a night filled with terror. I stayed close to Mr. Daniels and Ryan as we moved slowly toward the community center, which was now our next safe spot. The walk was quiet, and every sound was magnified. The soft whisper of the wind, the distant hum of emergency vehicles, and my own breathing. I couldn't help but think of how normal life once was, simple, calm, and free of this kind of fear. Now, every step reminded me that nothing would ever be the same. We finally reached the community center, a large, old building that had been converted into a shelter for people affected by the night's events. The entrance was guarded by a couple of volunteers who checked everyone in. Inside, the center was filled with tired faces, makeshift beds, and a quiet murmur of conversations. People were gathering in small groups, sharing what little food and water they had, and trying to comfort one another. In one corner of the large room, Mr. Daniels set up a small table with some extra notebooks and pens.
I need everyone who can see these events to write down every detail. Every memory, every sound, every sight is important. We might be able to stop this from happening again if we understand it better.
His simple words carried a weight that made me feel like our everyday lives depended on what we could remember tonight. I found a quiet spot near the back and sat down with my notepad. The community center was busy with activity, but there was a sense of shared purpose that made the fear a little more bearable. I looked around and saw parents holding their children close, older folks talking quietly about days gone by, and even a few teenagers trying to cheer each other up with jokes that didn't quite hide their fear. I listened carefully as Mr. Daniels explained what was known so far.
We believe that the strange events we have witnessed are connected to a tear in the sky, a break between our world and another. This tear is what has allowed these objects to appear. In the past, they were small and almost unnoticeable, but tonight the tear grew, and the main event became visible to all of us.
He paused, letting his words sink in.
Right now, we do not have all the answers, but we are working to learn more, and your notes and observations will help us piece everything together.
For a long while, I sat there, writing down everything I remembered from the night. The emergency alert on my phone, the sight of the giant, twisted figure in the sky, the way the safe house shook and threatened to collapse, and the hurried steps of everyone trying to escape. I tried to describe every small detail, the cold touch of the underground air, the creaking of the old stairs, the distant sound of sirens, and even the soft whispers of those around me. At one point, I looked up and saw Ryan talking quietly with an older man who was clearly shaken. The man said, "I remember when I was young, there were stories of strange lights and voices in the night. I never thought they were real until tonight." Ryan simply nodded, his eyes filled with worry and a hint of understanding. It made me realize that perhaps these events were not completely new, that our town might have seen odd things long ago and we had all forgotten about them over time. The night felt endless, and every minute was filled with both a search for safety and a need to understand what was happening. As we sat there in the community center, I could feel a mix of relief and deep sadness. Relief that we had managed to escape the crumbling safe house, and sadness for all the people who had suffered through this terrible night. Mr. Daniels's instructions echoed in my mind as I continued to write. Record everything. Your memory is our key to understanding this tear and the beings that come through it. I knew that, no matter how frightening the night was, our simple words and honest records might one day help bring back a sense of normalcy. I took a deep breath and looked around at the faces in the room. We were all ordinary people caught in an extraordinary event. Even though the night was filled with fear and uncertainty, there was also a quiet strength in our togetherness. We shared our stories, our fears, and our hope that one day we would understand the mystery of that tear in the sky. As I finished writing, I sat back and listened to the low hum of conversations, the occasional rustle of paper, and the soft beeping of a nearby radio. Outside, the darkness still held secrets, and the sky above North Vale remained heavy with unanswered questions. Yet, in that moment, I felt a small spark of hope. We were not alone in this terror. We were together, and that made all the difference. At dawn, the community center was filled with a quiet, determined energy. The night had been long and full of terror, but as the first light of morning crept over North Vale, Mr. Daniels gathered us for one final step.
Everyone, please come with me.
He said in a soft but steady voice. We all followed him into a small room that had been set up as a command center. The room was simple, old computers, blinking lights, and a strange machine that looked like a box with wires and little lights. I could see a few volunteers busy at work, checking reports and listening to the radio for updates.
Today, we will use this device to close the tear in the sky. Our team has been working on it for weeks, and now is our chance to stop these events from happening again. We believe that the tear is what allowed these strange objects to come into our world.
His eyes, full of both determination and sadness, met each of ours.
This might come with a cost, but we must try.
A mix of hope and fear swirled inside me as I clutched my notepad. I remembered every detail of the night, the emergency alert on my phone, the sight of that giant, twisted figure in the sky, and the shuddering safe house. Now, it all led to this moment. Mr. Daniels asked us to stand back as he and a small team began to prepare the machine. The device had many wires and little lights that blinked slowly in a regular rhythm. Soon, the room filled with a soft, steady hum. I stepped closer to the monitor that showed a live image of the sky through a small window. There, among the dark clouds, I could just make out the jagged tear. I also saw the giant, twisted figure with many eyes standing at the edge of that tear.
We are going to turn on the device now.
Mr. Daniels said.
Please, stand back and keep your eyes on the monitor.
I watched with my heart pounding in my chest. Mr. Daniels pressed a button on the machine. For a few long seconds, nothing happened. Then the hum grew louder, and the lights on the panel began flashing in a steady pattern. The air in the room crackled with energy. On the monitor, I saw the tear in the sky slowly begin to shrink. It was as if an unseen force was pulling the edges together. The giant figure in the sky shuddered slightly. I could almost feel the creature struggling, as if it did not want to be pushed back. The machine's sound grew louder, and I felt a slight tremble under my feet.
Keep watching,
Mr. Daniels said.
We are almost there.
I held my breath as I stared at the screen. Slowly, the dark gap in the sky grew smaller and smaller. The edges of the tear began to curl inward, and the swirling clouds moved as though they were being drawn into that gap. Then, the figure let out a deep, eerie sound, a mix of pain and anger that sent a chill down my spine. I could see on the monitor that its many eyes blinked and its shape seemed to ripple. In that moment, the machine pulsed with energy, and a brilliant flash of light filled the command center. I had to shield my eyes, and for a few seconds, all was white. When the light faded, I looked at the monitor again. The tear was almost completely closed. The dark gap was now just a thin line among the clouds, and the giant figure had vanished. A heavy silence fell over the room as everyone took in what had just happened. Mr. Daniels exhaled slowly, his face tired but relieved.
We did it,
He said quietly.
The tear is nearly closed, and the creature is being forced back into its own world.
His simple words meant so much to all of us. We had witnessed something so strange and terrifying, and now it seemed to be ending. I moved to the small window and looked up at the sky. The dark clouds were beginning to break apart, and soft beams of morning light started to peek through. The sky, once filled with a menacing tear and a looming figure, now looked calm and ordinary again. Outside, I could still see signs of last night's chaos: overturned cars, broken glass, and people slowly coming together. But there was a new feeling of hope in the air. Many of us in the command center stayed silent as we absorbed the change. I turned to Ryan, who gave me a small, sad smile.
We made it through.
He said softly.
I just hope we can go back to normal someday.
His words were simple, but I could hear both relief and lingering sorrow in his voice. Mr. Daniels then walked over to a table piled with extra notebooks and pens.
I need everyone to keep writing down what they remember.
He said.
Every detail matters. Your words will help us remember this night and understand what happened.
I took my notepad and wrote a few more lines, trying to capture the mix of hope and sadness that filled me. Outside, volunteers began moving around, helping those who had been hurt and comforting others. The community center was busy with people who were sharing food, water, and kind words. I saw a young mother holding her child close, and older folks quietly talking about how their town used to be, a peaceful, normal place. Now, everything had changed, but we were all coming together to rebuild what we could. The machine in the command center continued to buzz softly for a few more moments before powering down. Mr. Daniels looked around the room and said,
The breach is sealed for now, but remember, we do not know if this is permanent. We must stay alert, watch the sky, and record every detail. Our town might be saved today, but this could be only one battle in a long fight.
His words were simple, but they carried a serious promise. I walked over to the window one last time and looked up at the sky. The dark, menacing clouds had lifted, replaced by the soft light of dawn. There was no sign of the giant, twisted figure anymore. In its place was the clear sky of a new day, a day that offered us a chance to heal and rebuild. I felt many emotions at once: relief that the immediate danger was over, sadness for those we had lost, and a lingering fear that something like this might happen again. Yet, in that moment, a small spark of hope began to grow inside me. Our honest words and careful recordings, written in simple language and shared from the heart, might one day help us understand these strange events. I packed my notepad away and joined Ryan and the others as we stepped outside into the cool morning air. The streets of North Vale were still marked by last night's chaos, but there was also a sense of determination among the survivors. As we moved, I looked back at the community center, a place that had sheltered us from the worst of the night. It had become more than just a building. It was a symbol of our strength and our hope for the future. I knew that our lives would never be quite the same, but I also believed that together we could face whatever came next. I promised myself that I would keep writing down every detail, every memory, no matter how simple it might seem. Our story was one of fear, loss, and survival, but it was also a story of ordinary people standing up against something extraordinary. In our simple words lay the power to remember, to learn, and to perhaps one day prevent another night like this. With a deep breath, I stepped forward into the new day. The quiet murmur of voices, the soft clink of utensils, and the gentle rustle of papers reminded me that life was moving on, even after the darkest hours. I knew that while the tear in the sky was sealed for now, the mystery of that night would stay with us forever.